G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope you are super well. Now we have just passed the 6th year anniversary of the Z7, one of the two launch cameras for Nikon's Z mirrorless system. The Z6 and the Z7 were launched at the same time. I believe the date was the 27th of September 2018. And I think it's time to revisit the Z7 and ask the question, is it still good value? Well, that's where I want to start, because for the best of my understanding, you can't really buy a Z7 new anymore, and you can actually get a Z7, not a Z7 II, a Z7 refurbished in the USA from Nikon directly. So that's got to mean it's in good nick for $1,999 US. And then if you look at someone like KEH, they're selling for around $1,250 to $1,350 US. Here in Australia, you're looking at about 1,800 to 2,200 Australian dollars. This is astonishing from my perspective. I think I paid around 6,000 to 7,000 Australian dollars for my Z7. I essentially got the launch day kit, which was the Z7, the 24 to 70 f4, the F to Z adapter, and I even think it came with an XQD card at that particular time. Now, I was so excited about this combo because I had something like, 16, 18 f-mount lenses that were working on my D4 and my two D850s at the time, and basically the notion that I was getting full first-party support, that these lenses were essentially native to Nikon. Yes, there's an adapter, but this is still native. Nikon will ensure that the lenses work as they should. Now, of course, what we ended up finding out is not only did the lenses work as they should, probably more than 50%, probably more like 75% of my lenses did not have any form of stabilization. And with mirrorless cameras, with all of Nikon's full-frame mirrorless cameras, they all have come with IBIS, in body image stabilization. And thus, we were actually getting, for use cases like mine, our lenses were becoming even better. Something like my 24 or 85mm tilt shifts, my 85mm 1.4, my 50mm 1.4, my 24 1, all of these lenses now suddenly had stabilization when they didn't before. Along with that, what an EVF brings us is the ability to see what we're shooting in the moment. There's no requirement to look at the back of the screen after you've taken the shot, because you've already seen the shot when you took the shot. It's a brave new world, and at the time it was a brave new world. Obviously, Sony had been championing this brave new world with their alpha cameras, of which I did purchase the A7R on launch in 2013 and the A7R III in early 2018. I also purchased that camera as well. So I have a range of Sony mirrorless cameras and lenses, along with my rather large range of Nikon Z cameras and Z lenses. Z7, is it still relevant today? It's a great question. Ultimately, it comes back to something that I talked about all those years ago with the Z6 and the Z7. It all comes down to your use case. What do you shoot? If you are a wildlife, sports, or action photographer, there is obviously better choices today. And that might be a Z6 III, a Z8, a Z9, it might even be a ZF. Obviously, any Nikon Z camera with an XPEED 7 processor is giving you superior autofocus performance. And that is what any type of action, any type of fast-moving object photographer wants. Although I will counter that by saying, prior to all of these detection modes, photographers like me and everyone else, we were able to take photos and get successful outcomes using single point, tapping to focus and getting the shot when we needed it. And that's what we did for 2 decades, roughly, or more, of autofocus in both the SLR and DSLR eras. It's not to say that a Z7 with appropriate field craft won't allow you to get those sorts of shots. It's just modern cameras, like super modern cameras, they just make it, well, extremely easy. But we certainly were able to get those shots. Anyway, if we draw that delineation around autofocus, beyond that, when it comes to photography And if you're only shooting, I don't know, 5 frames a second or less, which as I've stated in another recent video, I rarely go above, well, 1 frame at a time. I suspect there's an enormous amount of photographers out there that don't use the 10, 15, 20 frames per second that we get now with the faster mirrorless cameras of the current generation. What I'm going to do is stick a poll below. I'd really love to get a feeling of what percentage of shooters out there that watch this channel and vote in this poll shoot above 10 frames a second or shoot below 10 frames per second, because this is where like your D850, your Z7, they were all around that sort of mark. This is what your sort of all-rounder high resolution camera has done for quite a number of years now, and it's only really quite recently that we've moved beyond that to 20, 30 and more frames per second. So I'd love you to vote in that poll. But basically, if you're shooting stills and you're in that 10 and below bracket, a camera like the Z7 or the D850, of course, they are absolutely magnificent cameras for the sub 10 frames per second, giving you absolutely beautiful images. Obviously, we get 45.7 megapixels. What I love about what Nikon is doing, D850, Z7, Z7 II, Z8, Z9, they're all the same. They're all 45.7 megapixels. Clearly, Nikon believes that's a sweet spot. I believe it's a sweet spot, absolutely, when it comes to video. Obviously, in the modern era of Z8 and Z9, we get 8K video out of that, which is fantastic for all of us hybrid users. Of course, not everybody's a hybrid user. Z7, talking about video, it has very competent video for that era. It shoots 4K 8-bit video, which was absolutely fantastic for the era. Remember, we're talking 6 years ago, and at that time, the majority of YouTube channels, which is where so much of this content ends up, most people were doing 1080p, and 4K was really only starting and really only started to happen as we got to the 2020s. And what that means is, even now, some channels are still 1080p, some channels are 4K. It means that the 4K in this camera is still relevant. You can still shoot 4K, 24 frames per second. Absolutely fantastic for making these types of videos. And I did do that for a number of years up until we got to the Z9, 2021, 3 years later. And I want to talk about image quality, which is probably the most compelling part of the Z7 today. Nothing has changed on that front. And here it is. I took the Z7 with me with another one of my favorite lenses, the 85 1.8S, to the Northern Territory. You would have seen in recent videos that I've been there, and I did use it for some of my shooting. And for example, I used it for some just gorgeous astrophotography and a few other bits and pieces. I had a lot of different things to shoot up there, so I didn't shoot with this as much as I wanted, but it just showed me that this camera still performs extraordinarily well and gives absolutely glorious images when shooting things like astro. Now, image quality wise, from my perspective, when we're looking at reports on dynamic range and so on, ultimately, if you never talk to anybody about any of those things, most people wouldn't know the difference. But if we do talk about the numbers and we do look on DxOMark, and we can see that the D850, the Z7, the Z7 II, they are basically all sitting in almost exactly the same spot when it comes to image quality. What we can probably draw from that is that the sensor that is in the Z7 is probably a derivative of the D850, and the Z7 II was tweaked and advanced ever so slightly from the Z7. But the bottom line is the differences between these sensors is almost non-existent. And I think if you were to do side-by-side testing, they're talking about a difference in overall image quality between the D850, which would be considered perhaps the best of the best. It's a 1% difference. The difference in dynamic range, not even worth talking about. You can see the charts here. It is absolutely negligible. At base ISO, they're almost all the same. And then when we move to the dual gain, again, they're almost exactly the same through the range. What Nikon has done here is provided us with a mirrorless, their first generation of mirrorless 45.7 megapixel camera, But the difference between a D850 and a Z7 is you've got to put the focusing system on the sensor. So they've had to add extra technology to that sensor to give us autofocus, which wasn't in the D850. That's not there. Autofocus is done a different way on the D850 when you're doing stills. And the penalty for bringing autofocus to the sensor, it's essentially indetectable by the human eye, and under scientific testing, well, we're talking like a 1% difference. This was a great achievement, and anyone stepping from a D850 to a Z7 was getting a very optically similar experience. But of course, it's more than that, because pretty quickly in my Z mirrorless experience, it was clear to me that the optics of the Z glass were just, I don't know how to describe it, but it's just such a leap forwards. Now, this is something I've talked about before, but you might be coming to my channel for the first time, so I'll just talk about it briefly. For those who've heard this before, you can just skip to the next chapter. Basically the range of 1.8S lenses, which is what Nikon released at the start, along with a couple of other lenses. But the first lens to come out, I believe, was the 35 1.8, the 50 1.8, and the 24 to 70. And what I found with those lenses, and they were basically Nikon's kind of entry-level primes at the time, but they were actually superior to the majority of Nikon's high-end F-mount primes at the time. And I own them, I still own them. I own the 85 1.4 F-mount lens. Cost more than this, cost almost double this lens. Not only did the Z7 have a sensor that was just about identical to the D850, which is considered the best all-rounder DSLR of all time. But that's just half the equation, that sensor, because the other half is the optics that the Z mount was providing, and they are superior. And that has been borne out now over the 6 years since this was released, where we see amazing lenses like the one we're shooting on here, the 50mm 1.2, the 85 1.2, the Planar. All of the long lenses are stellar. It doesn't matter whether you get the more affordable long lenses or just the ridiculous, I could buy a car instead long lenses. Every S lens is fantastic. There's no bad ones. And now we have this interesting range of Nikon's 1.4 primes, which we now have a 50 and a 35. I think there's a whole range coming, and they're also great. They're also better than F-mount lenses, but they're 1.4s, but they're Nikon's cheapest primes. That's the plan. Obviously, they're new at the moment. They will reduce in price, and then they will be Nikon's range of full frame cheapest primes that are really fast. Obviously, Nikon has some other cheaper primes like the 28 and the 40, but they're 2 and 2.8s. They're not 1.4s. So it's not just about the sensor that's in this, but it's also about this mount and the optics that this mount can provide. Another thing that was magic about buying a Z7 right at the start was there was E to Z adapters, which allowed me to also couple my Sony glass onto these. And that's just another cool thing. And that has continued to advance. The adapters have improved, they've become more refined, they've become better built. They keep up with all the firmware and software changes. And look, it means that if you, for example, wanted a high resolution camera with Nikon's color science, and you want to do landscapes or starscapes or portraiture or still life, or maybe you're a food photographer, you work in a studio, you shoot fridges, it doesn't really matter. You could also mount Sony glass with no penalty, which is pretty amazing. The other interesting thing about the Z6 and the Z7, they basically launched around the same time that Canon launched their mirrorless cameras, which were the R and the RP. Now, something that was surprising about the R and the RP is that they did not come with in-body image stabilization. And as I said, this did. And that was just very cool and very exciting, and it helps with low light photography and it helps with video. So that's all really good stuff. Now, probably the biggest and only downside, and the thing that Nikon copped the most flack about, was this right here, this single card slot. Now, to this day, I have still not had a single XQD or CF Express Type B card failure. Now, it doesn't mean it won't happen. I never saw marketing that this was Nikon's flagship or that this was Nikon's professional replacement. And the only thing this thing really had in common with the D850, which was the king of DSLRs, is the sensor. And I also want everybody to keep in mind that at that time, 2018, The D850 was 1 year old. It had been released the year before, and it was constrained for so long that new purchasers, new people that wanted to buy the D850 were probably still trying to get D850s when this thing launched. So from Nikon's perspective, if you wanted the best image quality, the most powerful camera, the most versatile system in the 45 megapixel range, you would still go for the camera that had just been released and was still constrained. What this was is their first foray into mirrorless. And I want everybody to remember that Canon's first foray into mirrorless was, it didn't have IBIS, and also the video specs were not as good. And Canon didn't make a 45 megapixel camera. I believe the R and the RP were around 30 megapixels if memory serves me correctly. Nikon's offering was actually the better of the two. For some reason, Nikon cops so much flack. I still don't get it to this day. Oh, and Canon, of course, only had one card slot as well, and their card slot was an SD card slot, which from my perspective is far inferior and more likely to fail than an XQD card slot of the time. Somehow Nikon, in those early days, I'm not talking 6 or 12 months later as firmware changed, and then another year and a half later when the R5 arrived. I'm not talking about then, I'm talking about right at the start. Somehow Nikon copped more flack. The other thing I want everybody to remember, and I will repeat, I did buy the Sony A7R in 2013 on launch because I thought, wow, allegedly
It had the same sensor as the D800.
I believe it was, and I thought, oh, I love the idea of having a
D800
in a really small body that I can use for sort of more social situations or just walking around having a camera in my back pocket. I'll still use my
D800
for professional work, but the bottom line is, it had that sensor. Not only did Sony compress the files, when I basically opened those files up and tried to jump into the shadows like I was used to doing on my Nikon cameras, the info wasn't there. It didn't work. So it was like, oh, this is not the same experience. 1. 2, build quality was terrible. Ergonomics were terrible. 1 SD card slot. Battery life was terrible. Handling in general was terrible. And I only say this, not to put the boot into Sony, but simply to say that their first generation cameras,
they were not as good
compared to Canon and Nikon's. For example, the first Sony had no IBIS. The first Nikon had IBIS. Even the second generation, the A7R II, I looked very closely at buying it, and as history would show, I ended up buying the A7R III because that actually started to become a good thing. Multiple card slots, IBIS, etc. So history's important. As much as people might want to say, oh yeah, but it was 5 years later, so they should have done better. It's not quite how it works. When Canon and Nikon were looking to make mirrorless cameras, they would have been looking at the Gen 1 Sony cameras and maybe the start of the Gen 2 cameras. Remember, the Sony camera came out in late 13, so essentially 14. 14 is when Nikon would have started looking at it. That camera then was around for something like 2 years. 2 years takes us to somewhere in 2015. This came out in 2018. That is what Canon and Nikon were basing their models on. And if they're basing their models on that's the decision they made, to base their models on what was in the market. That's normal, that makes sense. Then this makes sense. And Sony's improved cameras, the version 3s, they only came out in 2017-18. And there was no chance when this is coming out in 18 that they could do anything about it. It is simply not possible. These cameras are basically finished by the time you roll into 18 and they're being released about 6 to 9 months later. It's just not going to happen. It's a little bit specious to say that Nikon and Canon just weren't up there with Sony. They were absolutely up there with the Sony models that existed right until about 9 months before these ones came out. Anyway, that's a little bit of a sidestep in addressing the one card slot, which again, that's what Sony had and Canon had. They all had one card slot at the release of their first full-frame mirrorless cameras. Nikon was the only one to use this higher end, more professional standard, the XQD/CF Express standard. Today, is that a problem? Well, as I've said, I've never had a card failure. I've never had a card failure in this camera. I've never lost images. I've never lost anything. I don't think it's a problem. This camera, based on the prices that I talked about, around $2,000 here in Australia and around 1,200, 1,300 US dollars. For the image quality, if your use case fits, this is an amazing camera. It'll allow you to start a YouTube channel if you want to. My YouTube channel for a good year was shot on this camera. Although do keep in mind it's 8-bit, but there's no problem with Nikon's 8-bit. Just shoot in the flat profile. That gives you the most latitude. This is just a lot of camera for the money. I see no reason why it won't keep going strong for another 10 years. Love these cameras, very small. I feel equally happy about my Z6s, and both of them are still going strong today. All right, everybody, please don't forget to vote in the poll. Do you shoot more than 10 frames a second or less than 10 frames a second? And I suppose what I would say there is, if you have shot 10 frames a second, but you've done it like 4 times, that doesn't count. I'm talking about how you shoot most of the time. Please let me know if you've ever bought a Z7 or you'd ever consider a Z7. I love these cameras, just still as fantastic as the day they were launched. And obviously we can mount all of the beautiful Z mount glass, first party or third party. We have so many options today. Far removed from the day this was launched and there was 3 lenses just 6 years ago. We probably have over 100 now. There's 45, I think, in the Nikon range, and there's more than 5 in the Tamron range, 3 in the Sigma range. With all of the third party, I would say we're in excess of 100 lenses for Z mount today. Get out there, find yourself a Z7, have a play with it, even if you don't end up getting one. They're just fun to use. And as I said, the image quality out of this is up there with the D850. It just doesn't get better than that. All right, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. If this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now.